There was a morning, and maybe you remember one just like it when you woke up before the sun and walked into a kitchen that was already alive. The stove was hot, the skillet was singing, and the smell that hit you wasn't just food. It was a signal. It meant somebody in that house had been up since 4:30 thinking about you. That breakfast isn't on any menu anymore. You won't find it at a drive-through, you won't find it in a box. And the people who made it, the grandmothers, the farm wives, the Milltown mothers who had supper on before the men even came through the door, most of them are gone now. But what they knew, what they built every morning with their own two hands, that's worth remembering. Worth bringing back, even. Here's what I want to ask you. Do you know what a working man's breakfast actually looked like? Not the scrambled eggs and toast we call breakfast today, but the real thing? The breakfast that had to carry a man through 12 hours of hard labor in a field, a mine, a mill, or a logging camp? Because I promise you, what those people ate in the morning would stop most of us cold, and it was good. Better than good. It was the kind of food that made you feel like you could lift the world. Stay with me, because before we're done, I'm going to tell you about 8 of the most important breakfasts that fed this country for generations, and every single one of them you can make today right in your own kitchen for almost nothing. And I'm going to tell you the one thing my grandfather said every single morning before he picked up his fork. He said it so many times I hear it in my sleep. We'll get to that. But first, let me take you back. Welcome to Grandpa Almanac. If this is your first time here, pull up a chair. We talk about the old ways, the ones that actually worked. If you've been with us a while, you already know nothing we talk about here costs a fortune and nothing gets thrown away. Now, let's go back to the kitchen. The first breakfast on our list is one most people have completely forgotten, and it might be the most important one of all. It was called corn mush, or sometimes just porridge or hasty pudding, depending on where your people were from. And I know what you're thinking. Corn mush? That doesn't sound like much. But sit with me here, 'cause you'd be wrong. Before there was oatmeal in a packet, before there were toaster pastries, before there was anything that came wrapped in cellophane, there was cornmeal and water and a pot on the fire. That was breakfast in early America, not just for poor families, but for everyone. Farmers, soldiers, tradesmen, school children. George Washington's household served it. Abraham Lincoln grew up eating it. It was as American as the land itself. Now, you didn't just dump cornmeal in boiling water and call it done. A good cook knew to stir it slow and steady for at least 30 minutes, sometimes 45, until it thickened into something rich and creamy that would stick to your ribs until noon. Then you poured it into a shallow pan, let it cool overnight, and in the morning you sliced it into thick slabs and fried those slabs in lard or bacon grease until the outside turned golden and crisp. You ate it with a pour of sorghum molasses or a little butter if you had it, and maybe a cup of strong coffee black as coal. My grandmother made it every winter. She'd set that pan the night before. She called it setting the mush, and by morning it was firm and ready. She'd say, "You can't do a day's work on an empty stomach, and you can't fill an empty stomach with air." She meant it. That bowl of fried mush cost her maybe 5 cents to make, and it kept 4 kids and a husband going until past noon. Today you can buy a bag of stone-ground cornmeal for $2. You can make this for a family of 4 for less than the cost of one fast food biscuit, and it will fill you up in a way that biscuit never could. Corn mush. Don't dismiss it. The second breakfast takes us back to something people have been arguing about for over 100 years, and the argument is always about the same thing. Is it a breakfast food or a supper food? And my answer to that is yes. Salt pork and potatoes, fried together in a cast iron skillet until the edges curl and the whole thing smells like everything good that ever came out of a farmhouse kitchen. Salt pork was the cornerstone of the American working class diet for most of this country's history. It wasn't fancy. It was pork belly that had been packed in salt and cured in a barrel, sometimes for months. You could keep it without refrigeration. You could slice it thin and render it out for fat, Or you could cut it thick and fry it hard until it was something close to the best bacon you've ever tasted. The salt gave it a depth of flavor that today's grocery store bacon can't touch. Paired with sliced potatoes, yesterday's boiled potatoes were the best choice because they held their shape in the pan. This was a breakfast that gave a man or a woman the kind of slow fuel they needed for work that involved their whole body, not the quick sugar rush of a modern cereal. Real, lasting energy, protein and starch, fat for warmth. A farmer going out to plow a field in February needed every bit of it. I remember my uncle, a big, quiet man who worked in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. He'd come down every morning at 5, and his wife would already have that skillet going. He never said much at breakfast. He just ate. But one morning I was visiting, and I sat across from him at that table, and I watched him take his first bite, and he closed his eyes for just a second. Just a second. Like he was saying grace without words. That's what good food does. It stops you. Even for just a moment. Salt, pork, and potatoes. It still works. Now here's something I want to ask you before we go any further. Do you still have a cast iron skillet in your kitchen? Because if you do, take care of it. Season it right. Those pans last forever. Some of the ones still being used today were made 100 years ago. And if you don't have one, a good cast iron skillet is the single best investment you can make if you want to cook the way we're talking about. It changes everything about how food tastes. Everything. But hold on. We're just getting started. The third breakfast on our list might surprise you because it involves something you probably had for supper the night before, and that's completely on purpose. The third breakfast is what the old folks called leftover biscuits and gravy. Now, I want to be careful here, because biscuits and gravy as a concept is still alive in parts of the South and Midwest. But the original version, the one that came out of wood-burning stove kitchens in the late 1800s and early 1900s, was a different animal than what you find at a chain restaurant today, and the key to it was the word leftover. A good farm wife or boarding house cook made biscuits every single day, not from a can, from scratch lard, flour, buttermilk, a pinch of salt. She'd make enough for supper and enough to have extra, and those extra biscuits, left to cool on the counter overnight, were tomorrow morning's base. She'd split them open, arrange them in a pan, and pour hot sausage gravy right over the top. The gravy itself was nothing fancy pork sausage, broken up and browned in the skillet, then a couple of tablespoons of flour stirred in to soak up the fat, then milk poured in slow while she stirred to keep out the lumps. Salt and pepper, that was it. But that combination, the crusty-edged biscuit soaking up that creamy, salty, savory gravy that was one of the great breakfasts in the history of American cooking, ask anyone who grew up eating it. My grandfather, the same man I mentioned at the start, he ate biscuits and gravy 4 mornings out of 7. He worked the railroad for 31 years. And he used to say it to me, always, before he picked up his fork. Boy, when the food is this good and costs this little, life ain't as hard as it looks. We'll come back to that. Because he was right. He was absolutely right. The fourth breakfast might be the one that surprises people most. It's called scrapple. And I know the name isn't exactly an advertisement. But scrapple was one of the most ingenious, thrifty, nourishing breakfast foods ever invented on American soil, and it came out of the Pennsylvania Dutch and German immigrant communities in the 1700s. It was poverty food, in the best possible sense, food that wasted absolutely nothing. When a hog was butchered in the fall, nothing was thrown away. Nothing. The good cuts, the hams, the shoulders, the loins went into the smokehouse. But the scraps, the trimmings, the head meat, the organ meat that had been simmered down with the bones, those got mixed with cornmeal and buckwheat flour and seasoned with sage, thyme, black pepper, and savory until the whole thing became a dense, spiced loaf. You let it set up firm, then you sliced it thick and fried it in a dry skillet until both sides were dark brown and the inside stayed soft and hot. You could eat it plain. You could eat it with maple syrup, and if you've never had scrapple with a drizzle of maple syrup, you haven't truly lived in the fullest sense. You could eat it with eggs, or alongside potatoes, or on a piece of toast. The flavor was deeply savory, gently spiced, and nothing else tasted quite like it. It was complete nutrition for people who worked with their hands. Today, you can still buy Scrapple at specialty stores and some grocery stores in the mid-Atlantic states. But the spirit of Scrapple, the idea of taking every bit of what you have and making something greater out of it, that spirit is as useful today as it was in 1750. Because here's the truth. The people who invented Scrapple weren't wasteful. They were wise. And wisdom doesn't go out of style. We're about halfway through our list now. I want to make sure I've earned your time so far. If you're still here, if any of this is ringing a bell or bringing back a memory, tell me about it in the comments. There is nothing I love more than hearing your stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do that. Every week we put out something like this, something real, something you can use, something that connects you to the people and the traditions that made this country tough and tender at the same time. All right, let's talk about the fifth breakfast. And this one I have a particular soft spot for, because it's the one my own mother made on cold mornings when money was tighter than it should have been and she made it seem like a choice instead of a hardship. It's called milk toast. 2 words. And I want you to hold your judgment for just a moment before you decide that sounds plain. Milk toast was exactly what the name says, toast, soaked in warm milk with butter and a little salt and sometimes a pinch of sugar. That's it, the whole recipe. Start to finish, you could make it in 4 minutes. It cost almost nothing. And yet, on a February morning, when the wind was at the windows and the house was cold and you were 5 years old and maybe a little bit scared of the world, a bowl of warm milk toast was about the most comforting thing a human being could receive. It was gentle food, healing food, food that said somebody loved you without using a single word. Sick children got it. Elderly people with bad teeth got it. Working men who came home at night with nothing left in them got it. The bread soaked up that warm, buttered milk and went soft and tender and sweet and salty all at once, and you ate it with a spoon, and it warmed you from the center outward. It was cheap as rain, and it did its job perfectly. Now, today we'd probably dress it up, maybe a little cinnamon, maybe a grating of nutmeg, a drizzle of honey. That's fine. The old-timers would have approved. But don't make it fussy. The whole point of milk toast is its gentleness, its simplicity. It doesn't try to impress you. It just takes care of you. And that's a kind of cooking we've almost completely lost. Not the recipe, the attitude, the idea that food doesn't have to be elaborate to be generous. We could use a little more of that. The sixth breakfast takes us out of the farmhouse and into the mill towns and mining camps, because not every working man had a wife at home with a kitchen stove. Some of them were young and single, living in company boarding houses with 50 other men, eating what was put in front of them. And in those places the cook had one job: keep those men upright and working. Which is how we got something called oatmeal porridge with fatback. Not pretty, extremely effective. Oatmeal, not rolled oats from a packet, but real steel-cut oats or whole oat groats that had to be simmered for the better part of an hour, was the staple breakfast food of mining camps, logging camps, and railroad work crews from Maine to California throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s. The camps bought it by the sackful. It was dense and slow digesting, and it stuck. Add in pieces of fatback, the salt-cured fat from a pig's back, fried crisp and stirred right into the pot, and you had a breakfast that supplied the fat and protein a man burning thousands of calories a day in underground physical labor absolutely had to have. The camp cooks, and some of them were remarkable people, men and women who'd learned to cook for large numbers under difficult conditions. They knew that a hungry worker was a dangerous worker. A man who was cold, tired, and unfed didn't think clearly. He made mistakes. He got hurt. So the food wasn't optional. It wasn't a luxury. It was safety. I've read diaries from railroad workers in the 1880s, and you know what they complained about? They complained when the porridge was thin. They said that like it was the worst thing that could happen, and maybe, for them, it was. Because thin porridge meant a long, hard day with nothing holding you up. Thick porridge meant you could make it. Oatmeal with fatback, simple as a hammer, and just as useful. The seventh breakfast is one that fell out of fashion sometime in the middle of the last century, and I think we lost something real when it went. It's called buckwheat cakes with sorghum syrup. Not pancakes, not the fluffy, baking powder leavened ones we make today. Buckwheat cakes. Thin, slightly sour, fermented overnight from a starter. Dark in color, with a deep, nutty, almost earthy flavor that regular pancakes simply cannot produce. And sorghum syrup, not maple, not corn, dark amber, thick, with a molasses-adjacent richness that was its own kind of reward. Buckwheat was grown all over the northeastern and mid-Atlantic states in the 1700s and 1800s because it thrived in poor soil. Thin, rocky ground that wouldn't grow much else would grow buckwheat just fine. It was cheap, it was nutritious. And when you made a sourdough starter with it called a buckwheat sponge, you mixed buckwheat flour with water and a little yeast and let it ferment overnight on the back of the stove. By morning it was bubbly and alive and ready to pour onto a hot, greased griddle. The cakes were thin, dark, a little lacy at the edges. You stacked them 4 or 5 high on your plate and you poured the sorghum over the top and watched it run down the sides and pool at the bottom. The bitterness of the buckwheat and the dark sweetness of the sorghum balanced each other perfectly. Farm workers ate these every morning through the winter months. And then the cheaper, easier, modern pancake mixes came along, and buckwheat cakes just sort of drifted away. But if you can find buckwheat flour, and you can at most health food stores or online, this is worth reviving, worth every bit of the extra effort. It tastes like something true. Now here's something I want to tell you, because we've been talking about food for a while now, and I don't want you to miss the larger thing underneath all of this. Every single breakfast we've talked about was built on the same foundation. Thrift. Not cheapness, not deprivation. Thrift. There's a difference. Thrift means you take what you have and you make it into something good. You don't waste. You don't pretend you have more than you do, and you don't feel sorry for yourself about what you don't have. You make something real out of something simple. That's what these people did every morning. And I want you to hold on to that thought, because it matters when we get to the very end. The 8th breakfast on our list is one that most people today have never heard of, and it came out of the South and the border states, the Appalachian and Ozark regions especially, where people had very little but had figured out how to make that very little stretch in ways that could astonish you. It's called red-eye gravy and ham, and the story of how red-eye gravy got made is one of the best stories in all of American cooking. You start with a slice of country ham, salt-cured, smoked, aged, nothing like the pale, watery ham from the grocery store. You fry that ham slice in a dry skillet. When it's done, you take it out, and what you're left with in that pan is a dark, sticky, nearly black residue of concentrated ham drippings and salt. Now, here's where most people would just wash the pan. The old cook poured a cup of strong black coffee right into that hot pan. Just black coffee. And the steam and sizzle that came up smelled like the best thing on earth. The coffee hit the drippings and lifted them up and mixed with them and turned into a thin, dark, smoky, savory, slightly bitter liquid, and that was red-eye gravy. You poured it over the ham. You soaked your biscuits in it, and the combination of the salty, chewy, richly flavored country ham with that dark, bitter, savory gravy and a tender biscuit to soak it all up there is nothing like it. Nothing. People who've had it once never forget it. And the whole thing cost pennies, and the coffee you were going to drink anyway. The name red-eye, by the way, comes from what the gravy looks like when you pour it into a cup. The fat rises to the surface and forms a red circle in the center, like a red eye looking up at you. Andrew Jackson supposedly loved it. It's been part of Southern Appalachian cooking for over 200 years, and it nearly vanished entirely when cheap deli ham and instant gravy packets came along. But country ham is still out there. The recipe still works. And if you make it once, just once, you will understand something about flavor and about ingenuity that no cooking show will ever teach you. The ninth breakfast might be the most quietly remarkable one on our whole list because it looks like nothing at all. It's called pone bread and pot liquor. And I need to give you a little background here because pot liquor is something that younger generations have never encountered, and they're the poorer for it. Pot liquor, and in the old days it was written exactly like that, pot liquor. 2 words is the liquid left in the pot after you've slow cooked a mess of greens. Collard greens, turnip greens, mustard greens. You cook those greens for hours with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock, and the water they cook in absorbs everything, the vitamins, the minerals, the flavor of the pork, the deep green earthiness of the vegetables. That broth, that pot liquor, was considered precious. You didn't throw it away, you drank it, or you used it as a dipping sauce for your pone bread. Pone bread was a simple cornbread denser than what most of us make today. No sugar, no leavening, just cornmeal and water and salt shaped into small ovals and baked in a Dutch oven or fried on a flat griddle. Hard crusted on the outside, dense and hot in the center, you broke off a piece, you dipped it in that pot liquor, and you had something that was both a meal and a medicine. The vitamins in pot liquor, particularly vitamin K, folate, and calcium, are so concentrated that people in poverty-stricken communities stayed healthier than you'd expect, partly because they were drinking what people in better circumstances threw down the drain. My great-aunt, who lived in western North Carolina until she was 94 years old, ate pot liquor and pone bread 2 or 3 mornings a week her whole life. She used to say she never needed a vitamin pill because she had a pot of greens on the stove. Her doctor said she had the blood work of a woman 30 years younger. I believe it. I believe it completely. The 10th breakfast, and I've saved this one for last because it's the one that ties every other one together, is what I'd call the full farm breakfast. The one that happened on Sundays, or on the mornings when there was something to celebrate, or just when the cook was feeling generous and the pantry was holding. It wasn't one dish. It was all of them, more or less, coming together at once. A full farm breakfast in the early part of the last century might have included fried eggs from the chickens in the yard, eggs so fresh the whites were firm and the yolks stood up tall and dark orange, not the pale, flat yolks of today's grocery eggs. Salt-cured pork, sliced and fried, biscuits from the same lard and buttermilk recipe that hadn't changed in 50 years. A jar of last summer's tomato preserves pulled down from the shelf, a bowl of fried potatoes with onion, a stack of buckwheat cakes on the side maybe, with some sorghum, and coffee. Always coffee. Strong, dark, percolated on the stove in an enamel pot until it was almost chewy. This breakfast didn't come together fast. It might have taken an hour, sometimes more, before the family sat down. And the person who made it, almost always a woman, though not always, had been up since before light to do it. She'd fed the animals before she fed the people. She'd hauled in wood or stoked the coal. And then she stood at that stove and she made something out of almost nothing. And she set it on a table, and her family sat down and ate it in quiet gratitude. I think about those women a lot. I think about what they knew that we've forgotten. They knew how to read a pantry and see a meal instead of a shortage. They knew how to make a house warm with nothing but fire and food and purpose. They knew that breakfast wasn't just the first meal of the day, it was a statement about who you were and what you valued and how you intended to live. And sitting at those tables, eating that food, the children were learning something. They were learning it without being taught it directly. They were learning that good things can be made from simple things. That work is dignified. That a meal prepared with care is a form of love. That you don't need much to live well, you need enough, and you need to know what to do with it. My grandfather understood all of that. He'd lived it. He'd grown up in a house where that full farm breakfast happened every Sunday morning, and he carried that with him his whole life. 31 years on the railroad, raised 4 kids, never made much money, never complained much about it either. And every single morning, before he picked up his fork, No matter what was on his plate, whether it was an egg and a biscuit or a full spread or just that bowl of fried corn mush, he said the same thing. Always the same thing. He'd look at his plate, and then he'd look up, and he'd say, "When the food is this good and costs this little, life ain't as hard as it looks." I heard him say that 1,000 times, maybe more, and I didn't fully understand it when I was young. I thought it was just something old people said. But now that I've seen what food costs, what time costs, what it means to sit down to a meal that somebody made with their hands from something simple and honest, now I understand. He wasn't just talking about breakfast. He was talking about a way of living, a way of looking at what you have and choosing to find it enough. These 10 breakfasts, the corn mush and the fried potatoes and the salt pork and the biscuits and the scrapple and the milk toast and the buckwheat cakes and the red-eye gravy and the pot liquor and that great Sunday spread, they weren't failures of imagination. They weren't signs of poverty that people had to endure. They were solutions. Practical, beautiful, ingenious solutions created by people who had real skills and real wisdom and real love for the people they were feeding. And every one of those solutions still works today. Right now, in your kitchen, with ingredients you can get at any grocery store. The corn mush is $2 and fills a family. The biscuits take 20 minutes from scratch. The red-eye gravy uses coffee you were going to drink anyway. The pot liquor is free. It's what's left after you cook your greens. None of this is complicated. None of it is expensive. It just requires you to slow down a little, to stand at the stove for a while, to think about what you're doing and why. And maybe that's the real lost thing, not the recipes themselves, but the willingness to take the time. Because here's what I believe, and I believe it with everything I have. The time you spend at a stove making something real for someone you love is never wasted time. It is, in fact, some of the most valuable time you will ever spend. The people who made these breakfasts knew that. They didn't have to be told. They just did it every morning before the sun was fully up, because that's what you did when you loved your people. And those people, the ones who sat down at those tables and ate that food, they grew up strong. Not just physically, though they were that too. Strong in the way that matters most. They knew who they were. They knew where they came from. They knew that a hard day's work and a good meal on the other end of it were enough. More than enough. That's what we've lost. And that's what we can find again, starting tomorrow morning. Starting with a bag of cornmeal and a cast-iron skillet and a little bit of lard and the memory of someone who stood at a stove and made something good out of something simple because they thought you were worth the effort. They were right. You are. When the food is this good and costs this little, life ain't as hard as it looks. Thank you for sitting with me today. Truly. If any of these breakfasts brought back a memory, if your grandmother made the pone bread, or your father kept the cast-iron skillet, or you remember the smell of buckwheat cakes on a winter morning, please tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Your memories matter. They belong here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do that now. It costs you nothing, and it means we can keep doing this, keep telling these stories, keep passing along the things that are worth keeping. New videos every week. All of it free, all of it real. I'm Grandpa Almanac. I'll see you next time, right here at the kitchen table.